Okay, comrades, welcome to the meeting of the Workers' International Network. We are really honored to have with us today a veteran and a hero of the struggle in Israel and the Middle East, Comrade Moshe Machover. Moshe was one of the founders of the revolutionary organization Matpen several decades ago in Israel. It was an organization which, well, Moshe will correct me if I'm mistaken, but I believe it originally came as a split from the Israeli Communist Party, but it stood on the foundations of a complete rejection of Zionism, an unequivocal stand for revolutionary socialism, rejection of the cult of the Soviet Union, absolute rejection of Stalinism and the cult of personality, support for genuine international solidarity, support for the integration of Israel in a socialist Arab Union on the basis of self-determination. And we, of course, the comrades suffered all kinds of persecution and calumnies and slander, and they had their fair share of internal problems too, but they stood throughout an extremely difficult situation of racism, of communism, of chauvinism, and they kept the red flag of revolutionary socialist internationalism on high. I won't take up any more time. I'll ask for Comrade Moshe to speak for as long or as short as you feel appropriate. We'll have questions and discussion, and we have a relaxed and informal atmosphere in our meetings. And over to you, Moshe. We're really looking forward to hearing your contribution.
Thank you, Comrade Roger, for this introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you, but I must start with an apology. As I explained to Roger when he invited me to talk, this time of day is not ideal for me. I don't function too well. So please forgive me if I'm a bit slow and less fluent than I would normally like to be. Also, I may be asking to cut this session a bit shorter than the 2 hours that is advertised. I'm getting on in years and may be getting a little bit tired before the end of 2 hours. As this is the first time I'm speaking to this group, I can't take anything for granted. I don't know what, if anything, you know or think about the current situation in Israel, Palestine, and the wider Middle East. So I thought the safest thing is to start with fundamentals, and I'm going to hopefully cover 3 key fundamental issues, 3 fundamental foundations of the Zionist project of colonization. Hopefully, once you get hold of these key insights, I would say, you can better make sense of current events. They seem to people who are not familiar with the historical foundations of the problem, perhaps unexpected or haphazard, but in fact, the Zionist project of colonization is work in progress, and it has followed consistently along lines that were established quite early on, and understanding these provides keys to following intelligently the current events. So key concept number one, the Zionist project is a project of colonization. This is the first thing to grasp in order to be able to understand the current events and historical events. Israel is both a product of Zionist colonization and at the same time an instrument for its further extension and expansion. It is quite commonly described as settler colonialism. Israel is a settler colonialist state, and this is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. As such, it provides very inadequate grounds for understanding the history and the current functioning of this settler state. What I mean is that Israel, to put it in a short slogan like format, Israel is not like South Africa. And understanding the differences between the South African colonization under apartheid and Israeli colonization is absolutely essential to understanding the current situation. What do I mean by this? I mean that South African colonization under apartheid was based on exploitation of the indigenous population. Its political economy was based on their exploitation. In other words, the indigenous population were an asset for the colonizers. They needed the indigenous population as exploitable labor force. They needed, of course, they took over their land, they displaced them, but they didn't want to get rid of them altogether because they were actually basically necessary for the economy of the settler state of apartheid South Africa. Zionist colonization was quite different. As far as it was concerned, the indigenous people of Palestine were surplus to requirement. In this respect, Zionist colonization was much more like Australian colonization than South African. If you want to make comparisons, the Palestinians, indigenous Palestinian Arab population of Palestine was, for as far as Zionist colonization was concerned, surplus to requirement. They were, if anything, a nuisance. In fact, they were a peril from the point of view of Zionism, because the aim of Zionism was to establish a Jewish nation state. They understood from the beginning that if they establish the colonial project in Palestine as based on the labor power of the indigenous people, then the indigenous people will always be the majority, because in every society, in every political economy, the direct producers, people who actually do the work, are the majority of the people. You will see that the evolution of this type of colonization based on not on the labor power of the indigenous people, but on their exclusion, resulted in the formation of a new settler nation. And this is exactly what happened in Israel-Palestine. What came into being is a new settler nation, Hebrew-speaking, a colonial settler nation, which is the analogous to what happened in other places where colonization was not based on the labor power of the indigenous people. This was the case in Australia. You had a new Australian nation of settlers. You had the same in North America. You had in New Zealand. You did not get a new nation of settlers in South Africa. What you had emerging is a rainbow nation, which is not a nation of just the settlers themselves, who remained as a small minority. Okay, this is number one. So, and indeed, historically, if you look at the history of Zionism, right from the beginning, to this very day, ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population was recognized by the leaders of the Zionist project as one of the major aims of their project. They resorted to it whenever the opportunity arose. Hold on. Could you hold on for just one? I needed a drink of water. Okay. Major ethnic cleansing happened on various occasions. First of all, in the war of 1947-49, what Israel calls its war of independence and what the Palestinians call the Nakba, where a major ethnic cleansing took place. Another bout of major ethnic cleansing took place in 1967. More restricted, smaller scale ethnic cleansing took place from time to time during the history of the Zionist project. And of course, currently we are witnessing a huge bout of ethnic cleansing or attempt at ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and now currently in the West Bank, where a huge dislocation of Palestinian people is taking place while the media is focused elsewhere. You get some report of the happening in Gaza, but the horrendous events in the West Bank is less widely reported, at least in this country, in Western Europe, etc. So this is number one precept, that you have to understand that ethnic cleansing is not an incidental aspect of Zionist colonization. It is inscribed in its very essence and its very aims. And it is, as far as it is concerned, work in progress. Every opportunity for ethnic cleansing, such as a war or other major events which can be used as justification for ethnic cleansing, will be used as this is a key attribute of the kind of colonization that Zionism is engaged in. Okay, this is number one. Number two, key insight, if you like, into the nature of Zionist colonization. I've made a comparison in a negative sense with South Africa, in a more positive sense, in other words, a comparison of similarity with the colonization of Australia, North America, New Zealand. But Zionist colonization differs from all of these in one important respect. In all these other cases that I have mentioned, the colonizers were sent by a metropolis, by their mother country. Britain sent colonizers to Australia. They were British nationals or Irish people under British rule who were sent or deported to Australia. North America was colonized by partly by British subjects who came from their Britain as their homeland, as their mother country, some from France, etc., etc. In South Africa, again, you had people sent to colonize that part of the world by their mother country. Zionist colonization did not have a mother country. That is to say, the settlers were not sent by their original country to colonize that part of the world. Therefore, right from the beginning, even before Zionist colonization began in practice, when it was just an idea, it was just a plan. By the way, the Zionist, political Zionist movement was established in 1897. But even before that, the founders of the Zionist project of colonization wrote and understood very well that the colonial project of Zionism needed a surrogate mother. So Zionism, from the beginning, searched for a surrogate mother. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, tried several would-be sponsors as a surrogate mother. He tried, first of all, Germany. He appealed to the German Kaiser to sponsor Zionist colonization in Palestine. The Kaiser was not interested. He rebuffed this attempt. Well, everyone knows who eventually became the initial surrogate mother of Zionist colonization. It was the British Empire. The deal between British imperialism and Zionist colonization is known as the Balfour Declaration, which was a letter written by Lord James Balfour to the another Lord, James the Rothschild, in which Britain promised to sponsor the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was later, in 1922, inscribed into the mandate that Britain received, in fact, written by Britain itself from the League of Nations, and it served as a sort of founding document of the sponsorship of the Zionist colonization project by the British Empire. This lasted until the mid-1930s, where for various reasons that I needn't go into, Britain found it inconvenient to proceed with this sponsorship, and there was a period of, let us say, conflict between the Zionist movement and Britain, its original sponsor. I will not go into the historical detail, they are a matter of record. Everybody knows that at present the surrogate mother of the Zionist project is the United States, the American imperialism. not many people know that historically, in between the period when Britain was the imperial sponsor and United States went into this role, there was a period in which French imperialism was as it were, the surrogate mother of Zionist colonization. I will not go into the details, but let us say until the mid-1960s, Israel got its major armaments, aircraft, warplanes, and so on from France. Certainly not for Britain, but not yet from the United States. The deal between American imperialism and the Zionist project was really tightened and became ever more important from the 1960s, especially after the 1967 war in the Middle East. If you go back to the previous war, the Suez War of 1956, then Israel went into it as an ally of France rather than the United States. And in fact, it was the United States who put an end to this adventure of Britain, France, and Israel. Okay.
Yes, sorry, you're just meeting everybody, yeah. I think, yes, carry on. Sorry, Moshe.
The consequence of this fundamental fact is that Israel, in order to secure its role as being sponsored by the dominant imperialism in the region, at one time Britain, later France, and currently the United States, it needs to be dominant in the area. Israel, in order to secure its role, in order to secure its project of colonization, in order to be of value to its imperialist sponsor, needs to be hegemonic in the Middle East region. This explains many things that you currently observe in the events unfolding before our eyes in the Middle East. For example, the reason Israel is so fundamentally hostile to Iran, even more so than the United States itself. I mean, while the United States would, under certain circumstances, wish to make a deal with the Iranian regime, and the Iranian regime would certainly not object to this, not oppose it under suitable circumstances. It has made various steps in this direction, offering to make a deal with the Americans. This would be very dangerous from the point of view of Israeli interests, because it would create an obstacle, a competitor to its domination of the region, and make it less valuable to imperialism as, if you like, the main attack dog for the imperialist interests in the region. So this is number two. How am I doing for time? I've got one more key precept that I would like to explain. So if I'm allowed, I'll go on for maybe 5 or 10 minutes to explain one more thing that is essential in order to understand the history and current unfolding of events in the Middle East. I've pointed out that in all cases where colonization was of the same type as Zionist colonization, that is to say, not based on exploitation of the indigenous people, but on their exclusion, what I would call exclusionary colonization. The colonizers became a new nation. Zionism speaks about the entire collectivity of all Jews around the world as a nation. This is, of course, a misconception. The Jews all over the world constitute a religious denomination, which you join by religious conversion. If you are not Jewish and you want to become Jewish, you go to a rabbi and get converted to Judaism. In this respect, Zionism has done or is responsible for a sort of an illusion trick, similar in some respects to what Modi is doing in India, inventing what is essentially a religion as a sort of new nation. I mean, Hinduism is a religion, but Modi redefines it as a nation. Zionism did something similar, or has done something similar with the Jewish religion. The Jews all over the world constitute a religious denomination. In Israel, there has come into being a new Hebrew nation state. But what is unique in the whole, as far as I know, in the whole panoply of colonial project is that you have a new nation forming, a single nation forming among the colonizers, but also the colonized have crystallized into a single nation. If you compare Zionist colonization with all the cases that I've mentioned as analogous to it, Australia, New Zealand, North America, and so on, you did not have the colonized also crystallizing as a new nation. The closest to it is in New Zealand, where the colonized at least shared a common language, but it would be stretching the concept too far to say that they constituted a nation in itself under colonization. Certainly in Australia, the indigenous people had numerous languages, numerous cultures. They were never a single nation, the same in North America. In Palestine, something quite different happened for historical reasons that I didn't go into. So you have in the case of Israel-Palestine, the colonial conflict crystallizing or appearing on the surface as a conflict between two national entities. And this is how it is depicted in the media. If you look at the media, in the mainstream media, you will see that the conflict in the Middle East, in the best possible case, is described as a conflict between two nations, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. This is taking the surface as the reality. It is true that on the surface, this conflict has the outer form, this superficial form of an inter-nation conflict, the conflict between two national entities, whereas in its true nature, in its foundations, it is a colonial conflict. It is a colonial conflict that has the outer form of a conflict between two nations. Hence, the deceptive so-called solution of a two-state solution. You have two nations, let them share the territory. It is treated by the imperialist media as a symmetric conflict between two nations. Like, you had a conflict between France and Germany. There are two nations fighting each other over border territory. Of course, this is to falsify the basic nature of the conflict, which is a colonial one. I think I've exhausted the time that I was offered to speak, and I think these three fundamental precepts are what you need basically in order to follow the history and the events unfolding in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Comrade Moshe. That was really
Roger, I can't hear you.
Am I muted?
Now you're okay.
No, thank you very much, Comrade Moshe. That was really very interesting, and you would have been welcome to speak for twice or three times as long. But I think now is a good time to ask comrades to make their contributions, ask questions. Keep it fairly brief, please, because Moshe may not be staying for the full 2 hours, and we want to hear his comments. Who's first for the discussion? Yes, Finn.
Comrades, I want to thank Moshe for his contribution, which was very informative and had lots of insights. Well, I particularly was interested in that presentation about South Africa and apartheid, because while the system in Israel is divisive in terms of the way Palestinians and Jewish citizens are treated, and that's an apartheid system and is properly described as such, but the tasks of overthrowing apartheid are not similar. In South Africa, once universal suffrage was introduced, the apartheid regime fell. That's not the demand which will resolve the question in Palestine. So it's a good point that he made. I went on a visit myself to Palestine in 2017, and there's a few questions I will ask in relation to that in a moment. But first of all, I want to just comment on the Balfour Declaration of 1917. By the way, that declaration was incorporated into the Covenant of the League of Nations as well. But anyway, Balfour was at that Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and there was a proposal, and he was one of the senior negotiators on the British side. Japan fought to introduce, and Japan fought with the Allied powers in World War I, but Balfour, Japan, tried to have inserted into the Covenant of the League of Nations a clause outlawing racism and a clause which would deal with racial equality. The proposal was squashed by Balfour, who was a leader of the British delegation, one of them. And here's a quotation from Balfour at the time. He says, he could not believe, he says, that a man in Central Africa was created equal to a European. So you can see straight away from Balfour's own words the way he saw nations other than those whom the British considered to be advanced. When we ourselves visited Palestine a few years ago, first of all, when we arrived in Tel Aviv airport, I was with a delegation, a trade union delegation. 4 of our number were immediately deported from Tel Aviv and weren't allowed to enter, to leave the airport and go to the West Bank. During our time there, we visited places like Bethlehem and the refugee camp outside Bethlehem, Hebron, Jerusalem, Nablus. We visited a refugee camp there, Ramallah, where we met representatives of the BDS movement in Palestine. But I want to ask Moshe, if you could maybe tell us a bit about some of these groups. We met Badil, which deals with the illegality of the occupation. These are Israeli-based groups largely. Breaking the Silence, which is a group of Israeli soldiers who are opposed to the actions of the IDF in Palestine. B'Tselem, which is a human rights organization based again in Israel. So I'd like if Moshe could tell us a piece about these groups today and what influence they might have in the difficult circumstances that now pertain in Israel. Another question that I'd like Moshe to deal with is the role of the Histrodot. Now, historically, the Histrodot has associated itself from the very outset with the Zionist project, banning Palestinians from full membership of the Union. The policy was to employ Jewish workers in Israel and so on. But it was a movement, a workers' movement nonetheless, even though it was tied to Zionism. So I'd like to hear Moshe's views about the history of us today. And also, is there an alternative trade union movement starting to emerge in Israel? Because Israel is a class society, irrespective of the detailed issues that we have to deal with in relation to rights of Palestinians. It is still a capitalist class society and a divided society, and I believe it's one of the most unequal societies in the world in terms of the division between the owners of wealth and the workers. And I understand also that the settler movement is partly a way of, from the Israeli ruling class point of view, of solving issues for them of inequality between workers, because workers can't afford to live or to buy property in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So the Israeli government allocates them land in Palestinian territory, and the settlements are what's involved there. When we were in Palestine, we saw the wall. It's called the apartheid wall or the annexation wall, or it's got various names. But it's a really impressive division right across it, winding its way across the north and the central areas of the West Bank. It combines all kinds of stuff like barbed wire, huge concrete slabs. The wall is 8 or 9 meters high. It's worth commenting as well, by the way, that an Irish company, Cement Roadstone, helped to build the wall in terms of it's one of the big construction companies here producing cement and other products. It was involved in the construction of the wall. But the wall itself is a massive project dividing various areas of the West Bank, separating Palestinian workers from their workplace, from their farms, and places of that nature. When we were, I've mentioned this before, but when we went to Hebron, we went to see the Abraham, that's the tomb of Abraham. And outside the mosque in that area, not far from the mosque, is a monument to Goldstein, who was a mass murderer who killed Muslim worshippers in the mosque some years back. There's a monument to him just outside, not far from the mosque itself, you know. So I would like, as I say, Moshe, to deal with some of the questions, and also this issue. There's a tradition of socialism and socialist thinking in the origins of the Israeli state, but these aspects were quashed and pushed off the agenda completely by the Zionist project. But what I'm wondering is, are there any socialist movements emerging today in Israel? So I asked previously about the trade union movement, so I'm interested in particular about the growth of trade unions and the ability of trade unions to combine and to operate together with Palestinian workers. A lot of Palestinian workers, it's less so now, but used to travel from the West Bank into Jerusalem. We saw outside Bethlehem huge numbers of Palestinian workers traveling through cages and security fences and barriers and every possible obstacle in their way every morning for hours, queuing, squeezing through security barriers in order to work in Jerusalem, and the process repeated again when they come back. So even with all of these restrictions and all of these horrors that Palestinian workers face, have there been examples of unity between Palestinian workers and Jewish workers? Read a book recently about trade unions, unofficial trade unions emerging amongst Palestinian and Jewish workers, particularly in the building industry. Is there evidence of that now, given all that's happened since? Huge numbers of workers used to leave Gaza and travel into Israel to work. They've now all been stopped. That process has been stopped. So what influence do unions have in fighting these basically mass sackings of workers from Palestine? There is a Palestine Trade Union Confederation, which has some influence amongst Palestinian workers. But what's its relationship to any trade union structure that might exist today in Israel? So thank you again, Moshe, and just taking the opportunity of your presence and your knowledge of the situation to ask us some questions that arose during our visit there some years ago.
All right, thank you, Finn. Moshe, normally we take sort of 2 or 3 questions together and ask the speaker to come back, but Finn asked a number of questions there, and your time is limited. If you would like to reply now, you're welcome, or if you prefer to wait for 2 or 3 more contributions, it's up to you.
Well, I mean, these have been such a list of very knowledgeable and pertinent questions that it would take me, in order to do justice to just these points that the comrade has made, it would take me twice as long, at least, as my main introduction. I'll try to very briefly deal with some of them. The first point was about organizations such as Badil on the one hand, which is a Palestinian-based organization, basically, and B'Tselem and similar human rights organization within Israel. I think they are playing an important, a vital role. As far as the Israeli B'Tselem is concerned, and the human rights similar or an organization consisting mainly of former soldiers who report on what they were ordered to do. They are becoming, at the same time, radicalized and isolated. The atmosphere within Israel is becoming much tighter. The persecution of human rights activists is becoming harsher. The persecution of people expressing critical oppositional views is becoming ever more difficult for them, isolating them, sacking them if they're let's say, employed as in educational establishments such as schools or universities, strong pressure to sack them, etc., etc. But I think they are playing an important role as witnesses to the iniquity that is taking place and protesting against it. I mean, B'Tselem, for example, hesitated for many years to define the situation in Israel-Palestine as a kind of apartheid. But a few years ago, it actually saw the light and came out explicitly in defining this situation as apartheid. I would say that I would warn against taking this definition as an analogy with South Africa, because in effect, the Israeli form of apartheid is far worse than the South African case. As I pointed out, the South African case was political and social apartheid, but it was not economic apartheid, because the regime depended on the work of the labor force of the indigenous people. In the Israeli case, Israel is, and the Zionist project historically is trying to minimize its dependence on Palestinian workers, making very harsh restrictions. In fact, although Comrade Finn has seen masses of workers crossing from the West Bank and Gaza into Israel before the current war started. Their numbers were strictly controlled and confined to mainly two branches of the Israeli economy, namely construction and agriculture. Israel preferred to import workers from far away, like China, Philippines, and other, countries in the Far East, rather than allow too many Palestinian workers to enter the Israeli economy. This was a conscious policy designed to minimize the leverage that Palestinian workers would have on the Israeli state. They realized that allowing a South African situation to emerge in which the indigenous labor force had acquired a lot of leverage against the South African apartheid regime would be a dangerous development to encourage. As for the Histadrut, this is a story in itself. The Histadrut was formed initially and continued for many years as a racially segregated trade union. Its official title, Histadrut, means just organization. The word Histadrut in Hebrew means organization. The full title of the Histadrut was the Histadrut of Hebrew Workers in Palestine. Histadrut העובדים העבריים בארץ ישראל. That is to say, it was designed explicitly to organize workers of the colonizer community. And it has continued in this way for many years as explicitly an arm of the colonial project of Zionism. In fact, when the organization that I helped to found, Matzpen, was formed in 1962, one of our basic aims, or one of our basic demands, was to create for and by the Israeli working class, that is to say, workers of both the so-called Jewish nationalities, in reality, the Hebrew nationality that emerged, as well as the Palestinian minority that existed in Israel that escaped or evaded the ethnic cleansing of the 48 war, an internationalist, independent trade union. This was then a call in the wilderness, but over the last, I would say, 2 decades, an independent internationalist labor organization has actually been formed. So in reply to the direct question, what about an internationalist trade union within Israel? Yes, there is a growing organization of this kind. It is called Workers' Power. If you Google it, you will find, in Hebrew, it is called Koach LaOvdim. It is an internationalist democratic federation of trade unions, which is doing a lot of good work, and several Matzpen veteran comrades in other sections of the anti-Zionist left are active in it. In addition to this, there is an organization called Kav LaOved, Workers Hotline, which is a support organization for Palestinian workers and other non-Israeli national, that is to say, international imported labor force who find themselves in Israel under harsh conditions of exploitation. So this is a support group in which both Israeli Jewish, so-called, and Palestinian Arab militants are active. As for the settlers in the occupied territory. I think comrades should understand that these come in two varieties. There are actually two kinds of settlers. One kind of settlers are people who, not out of special political messianic ideology, but simply for economic reasons, take up the assistance that the settlers of their kind, receive from the Israeli state, get cheaper housing, etc., loans, in order to acquire housing at the level which inside Israel is beyond their means. In other words, there are settlers who settle in the occupied territories not for ideological or political motivation, but simply out of economic convenience. Of course, once they settle there, they acquire, as it were, a new interest in the continuation of the occupation, because that becomes their home. And this is, in fact, the purpose of subsidizing their housing. A second category of settlers are messianic ideological settlers whose purpose is to basically get rid of the indigenous population of the occupied territories. They are there in order to further the aim of ethnic cleansing. These engage in daily pogroms against the Palestinian population around them, assisted by the Israeli armed forces. The last point was about, I think, an allusion to socialist Zionism. There was such a concept, a movement of socialist Zionism, which was in fact dominant in the Zionist movement until the recent decades, when the former socialist Zionist parties dwindled into virtual insignificance. This was a very strange kind of socialism. The socialist, so-called socialist Zionist parties were foremost in excluding Palestinian workers from occupation in the colonial sector. During the period of the British Mandate, lasting from basically from the 1920 till 1948, these socialist Zionists were very active in going from place of employment to place of employment and attacking the employment of Palestinian Arab workers and trying to replace them. In other words, this was known as conquest of labor. So the so-called socialist Zionists were foremost in the project of excluding the employment of Palestinian workers in the settler economy. I think I've covered most of the points.
Yeah, very adequately. Thank you very much, Comrade Moshe. Matthew, you're next. If you don't mind, try to keep it fairly brief.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think thanks to Moshe for his introduction, which was extremely useful, and obviously with great knowledge that none of us will ever match. I think the other thing, of course, is the nature of imperialism itself, and where we're at the moment, which is the decay of US imperialism. What's impressive, actually, of course, is the absolute determination all the imperialists to support Israel. at whatever cost. None of them have broken ranks. All of them have attempted to repress the pro-Palestinian movement, particularly in their own countries. It's been quite staggering, that they've gone to this enormous effort. It clearly, what's marks the fact that Israel forms such a central point of their control of the Middle East. How vital it is to them. How much they're prepared, how much effort they're prepared to go to keep it going. The fact that obviously the likes of the British, as been explained by by Declassified UK, that of course the links between the British state and the IDF and the Israeli state are extremely strong, and have continued, and the British have actually played a huge role in the genocide in Gaza. And the fact that, as I say, as the thing falls apart. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, actually, the other thing that they've done, of course, is to suppress all forms of media, as we can see. I mean, you can't actually read the media in the Western countries now because it doesn't have anything in it. They've excluded it. If you need to find out what's going on in Israel or politics or any of that stuff, you have to read either the Israeli media, which is extraordinarily free compared to the Western media, which is almost entirely propagandistic, or the Arab media, which itself is an issue because obviously the likes of Al Jazeera is run by Qatar, which has its own interest and refuses to print some things. So you actually have to find, to dig to find actually what's going on in the politics of the whole thing anyway. And how that as I say, that really very central focal point for imperialism, and the fact that obviously if Israel is defeated, which I think is a very clear possibility and something they're obviously terrified of, it would mark an enormous blow to imperialism throughout on a world scale. So in those terms, I mean, it's a really, it's a world conflict. I mean, it's not just a local conflict now. It's a world conflict. I mean, billions of people now identify rightly with the struggle of Palestinians for their freedom and rights and so on. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. There's nobody else with their hands up, but I've got a couple of points I'd like to make. But Moshe, you're welcome if you like to answer that point first.
No, I think this was a brief intervention, so I'd rather hear your points and then come back.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to make a couple of points. First of all, I'm really fascinated by Moshe's introduction, and I think I'd be very happy if he would come back to us sometime and we could continue the discussion for a little longer. But I want to say something. I have to first of all make a confession that in my very early youth, and I grew out of it by the time I was 14, but I was a Zionist. I was a socialist Zionist. I was a member of Hashomer HaTzair, which was the youth group of the party Mapam, which I think it's true to say was the furthest left of the established parties in Israel. But it was a Zionist organization. I always thought it was a socialist Zionist organization. Now, of course, I soon saw through my mistake, but nevertheless, we have to say that there were some heroic figures who did fall under the spell of Zionism. For instance, the leader of the, again, if as I understand it, Moshe will correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the main leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Mordecai Aralevich, was a member of Hashomer HaTzair and played a heroic role and gave his life in trying to liberate the occupants of the ghetto. And there are other examples, but I don't want to take up much time on that. I think what we have to see Zionism as, of course, it was a absolutely reactionary phenomenon from the time, and it was, as Moshe has explained, as we all understand, that it was supported and financed, and it was a project of imperialism, first of the British imperialists to protect their domination of the area, their sea route to India, and keep an eye on the Arab masses. At the same time, and later, of course, by American imperialism. I didn't know that the French also had a role, but that was something that was new to me. But American imperialism, obviously, that is a crucial part of their overall strategy. In fact, it's decisive. So I agree with everything that Matthew said on that too. But initially within the ghettos before the Nazi Holocaust, of course, Zionism had very little support. It was a very weird, mystical sect. It was completely rejected by the people of the ghettos in Eastern Europe, who mainly supported the Bund, a socialist organization, and whose attitude to the Zionists, who said emigrate to Israel, their response was, "We're going nowhere. We stay. This is our home. We're not going to be chased out by racists and by pogromists, and we're not going to do them the favour that the Zionists are asking them to do, to leave." So that was quite clear. And it was the Holocaust which I think created such despair among the Jewish communities that began to develop a mass support among, well, if you could call it masses, but support among the displaced persons at the end of the Second World War, people who are languishing in displacement camps, displaced persons camps, and who wanted to go to Israel not because they were Zionists particularly, but because they wanted somewhere to live, and they had to live somewhere, and they had no particular imperialist objectives in mind. And I think we can say, in a way, before that, would you not say that the early Zionists were something like, you can make a comparison with, say, the Marcus Garvey movement in America of the black population, a small sect among the black population of USA, who thought if we go back to Africa, we could have a state of our own, and we can escape the persecutions that we're suffering now, and so on. So I'd be very interested to know Moshe's opinions on those points. But one last question too, which is of course the crucial one, is there any possibility that you can see of any kind of common movement of opposition to capitalism and imperialism among Jewish and Arab workers, Jewish and Palestinian workers together? Of course, we see very little sign of that, or no sign perhaps of that at the present time. How would you assess the movement against Netanyahu, which was very strong in the period just before October the 7th, when there were was it weekly or daily, but mass demonstrations to get rid of Netanyahu, and also what do you think are the prospects now? We do see some elements of opposition to the government now, mainly of course among the families of the hostages. But nevertheless, what do you think are the prospects in Israel? What do you think is going to happen? Sooner or later, the war is going to come to an end, probably with the most horrific and devastating defeat, it seems to me, for the for the Palestinian population. Again, I'd welcome Moshe's views on that. But what do you think are the prospects from the point of view of internationalism and socialism?
Thank you. If I can come back now, I mean, Matthew's point, very brief. It is not a coincidence that in all imperialist countries you have a sort of the same persecution of any opposition to Israel. It is commonly attacked under the false pretext that it is quote unquote anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. which, if you come to think of it, is itself an anti-Semitic concept, because it implies that all the Jews, that if you criticize Israel, you attack all the Jews, which implies that Jews around the world are somehow responsible or represented by the atrocities of Zionism. It makes, as it were, the assumption that Jews are complicit in the crimes of the Israeli settler state. So if you attack it, you attack all Jews. It makes a false association, which in principle is itself anti-Semitic. I don't think there is any near prospect of Zionism being defeated. I'll come back to it in my response to Roger's point. And I'll explain why I think it is not a prospect for the near future as hoped by.
Hello, you. Hello, Doggy Doctor.
Oh, sorry, 1 second. Yep, sorry, carry on.
Okay. Roger says that he started off as a member of Socialist Zionist youth movement called Hashomer Hatzir. Guess what? So did I.
Right. I feel a bit better now. Thank you.
Wait. It's not a coincidence. At some point, I was expelled from Hashomer Hatzir, and as a young man, I mean, I was 17 at the time, 16 or 17. I joined the communist youth movement, and eventually was expelled from the Communist Party for criticizing its Stalinist stance. Hashomer Hatzir was. It is not. Roger and I are not isolated cases of Hashomer Hatzir being a conduit to anti-Zionist and radical socialism. It has played this role for a lot of people. I mean, let me quote. I mean, you may have heard of Abraham Leon, the Marxist theoretician on the nature of the Jewish people, a Marxist analysis of Jewish history. He started as a member of Hashomer Hatzir. So did his protege, his disciple, Mandel, who became leader of Trotsky's Fourth International. He started also as a member of Hashomer Hatzir. The reason for this, and there are many others, some better known, some less well known, and the reason is the following. In Hashomer Hatzir, they try to make a sort of combination of Marxism and Zionism. So they indoctrinated their young people with both Zionist ideology as well as those of Marxism. It's true that the Marxism that they taught was somewhat Stalinized, but still it gave their youth access to Marxist literature. At a certain point, some of us, I think it includes Roger, it includes myself and many others, saw that there is incompatibility between the two components of Hashomer Hatzir ideology. It simply doesn't fit together. The Zionism that you're being taught is incompatible with Marxism. And some of us have found the Marxist component more persuasive. And that led us to junk the Zionist part of the Hashomer Hatzir ideology and go towards Marxism. So this is by no means a coincidence, and it applies to lots of other people who have become communists and Marxists of various shades, who have started their political education in Hashomer Hatzir, the first Marxist books that I read was as a member of Hashomer Hatzair, you see. So that is by no means a coincidence. Yes, certainly, Roger is absolutely right that until the Second World War and the Nazi genocide of Jews, Zionism was a minority movement among Jews in Europe. Certainly, it was a minority movement among Jews in the Muslim countries, in countries like Iraq, Morocco, and so on. These were the two big Jewish communities in Muslim countries. There were some also in Iran and other Syria, etc., etc. Certainly, they were a minority. The Zionists were a minority. Now, in Europe, because of the Nazi genocide, a lot of Jews gravitated in despair towards Zionism, and it became stronger there. In the countries of the Middle East, those and North Africa that I mentioned, Muslim countries, the process was a bit different. The success of the Zionist project in Palestine and its iniquities towards the Palestinian indigenous people created hostility and in some places persecution by the majority, or especially by the state authorities in these countries against the Jewish minorities who had lived in a much better situation than in Europe. I mean, the position of Jews in Iraq and in North Africa until the advent of Zionism was much happier than in places like Poland or Ukraine, or let alone Germany. But because of the iniquities of Zionism, the local Muslim population turned to some extent against the Jewish minority, making a false identification again, which is now being used by the state authorities in the West. A false identification between Zionism and Jews. And this worked to the detriment of Jewish communities in those countries. Yes, the Zionism had a sort of analog among the black population, especially in the United States. That is Marcus Garvey's movement of Back to Africa, which was rightly described as Black Zionism. It failed because it didn't actually manage to do the deal that Zionism made with its imperialist sponsors. You see, the success of Zionism was due not only to the misfortune of the Holocaust, the genocide of Jews, but also to the fact that, as I explained, Zionism managed to form a sort of deal with imperialist sponsors. Marcus Garvey never managed to successfully forge a similar deal, and therefore this is one of the reasons why his movement failed. There were certainly other reasons as well, but the analogy is there and it has often been made. I'm now coming to the great issue, which would probably need another session to go into detail adequately, and that is as to the future. How is the situation being resolved? How is it going to be resolved? First of all, let me make one point. There is no cause for excessive optimism. The reason is that if you look historically, in all the cases where similar type of colonization took place, I mentioned Australia, New Zealand, North America, where the settlers, rather than being a small quasi class of exploiters of indigenous labor, were determined to marginalize, exclude, and expel, ethnically cleanse the indigenous people. In all those countries, the conflict historically ended with the defeat of the indigenous people and the success of the settlers. If you look at Australia, North America, it didn't end well for the indigenous people. So the historical record is not very promising. That doesn't mean that it is determined. Nothing in history is determined. The future is always open, but the prospect, I mean, one should not, I'd like to put it this way, I'm not here to spread false optimism. The reason for this is that unlike South Africa, where the indigenous people had an enormous leverage against the apartheid regime, the indigenous people in the countries like Palestine, Australia, etc., did not have a similar leverage. The difference, of course, is that we are not living in the 19th century, but in the 21st century. So there are prospects, there is a possibility for a different resolution of the colonial conflict in Israel-Palestine. But the conditions for it are far from, let us say, being satisfied or being in existence right now. Because of the nature of the conflict, which is, as I said, not a symmetric conflict between two nations, but basically a colonial conflict, the conflict can be resolved in a benign way, not by the victory of the settlers, but in a benign way, in favor of the preservation of the identity of the indigenous people, by the overthrow of the colonial regime. That is to say, a necessary condition for the benign resolution of the conflict is the overthrow of the Zionist regime of Israel. Now, in order to overthrow this regime, you need a social force that is both capable and interested in overthrowing this regime. I think it is very unlikely for this regime to be overthrown from the outside. Israel is a hegemonic superpower regionally. It is the local superpower. You see its vicious power in recent events. I need hardly point out at Israel being lording over its surrounding with its superior military power. It seems highly unlikely for Israel to be overthrown from the outside. There is no force from the outside that is capable of performing this task. Certainly not visible at the moment. Certainly, there is a force internally in Israel that is capable of overthrowing the Zionist regime. Like in every country, the working class is capable of overthrowing the existing regime. The Israeli working class, predominantly Hebrew-speaking, but with a substantial minority of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, is capable of overthrowing Zionism. But is it interested in doing so? In the present circumstances, no. What would the Israeli working class, predominantly Hebrew-speaking, gain by overthrowing the Zionist regime and establishing the much advocated single democratic state, let's say of the kind that you have in South Africa, not a socialist resolution, but overthrowing the apartheid regime of Israel? The answer is that whereas in South Africa, the working class gained from the overthrow of apartheid, they didn't gain socialism, but it gained politically. It gained at least the possibility of organizing in a much less constricted way than it used to be under apartheid. There is nothing analogous for the Israeli Jewish working class. It is not in its interest to exchange its position now as an exploited class, but with national privileges, to a situation in a capitalist, democratic, secular state in which it would be still an exploited working class, but without national privileges. This is not a deal that you can expect the Jewish working class to accept. What kind of situation would change this balance of let us say loss and gain? If it was a question of a regional, and it has to be regional, socialist transformation, a radical, changed region of the Middle East, in which the Israeli Jewish working class would be invited to exchange its position of an exploited class with national privilege to a position of a class without national privileges, but as a partner of a new dominant class in the region, and it has to be a region because socialist transformation in a single country, certainly in a country of the size of Israel, is not all. That is to say, in a regional socialist transformation of the Middle East, there is at least theoretically a possibility of the Israeli working class exchanging its political national advantage as a part of a dominant nationality for a class advantage of being part of the regional dominant class. This is what the organization that I helped to found in 1962, Matzpen, was advocating right from almost from the beginning, right, certainly from the mid-1960s. And I think this, at least theoretically, is a possibility that a benign resolution of the colonial conflict in Israel-Palestine could become possible. I'm not saying that it is very likely. I'm not saying that it is a prospect for the immediate future, but at least it is, in principle, a theoretical possibility. All other ideas of resolving this conflict in a capitalist context, I think are illusory at best.
Oh, thank you, Moshe. That is very interesting to hear you make that point, because we've been really coming to the same conclusion in our discussions that after all, it's not only Israel, but all the states of the entire region of North Africa and the Middle East, which are completely artificial, which were simply carved up arbitrarily by British and French imperialism at the end of the First World War with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and that you couldn't really envisage either a so-called two-state or one-state solution based on the artificial territory of Israel or Israel Palestine or whatever we want to call it. That really a socialist federation of the entire region would be the only possible way forward. And of course, we accept, as you say, Moshe, that's not something which is on the order of the day. But I think it's something that as socialists, it's the only solution that we should be campaigning for and striving towards.
Yeah, can I make two comments? First of all, I direct you to the website of Matzpen, the organization that I helped to found in 1962. The organization doesn't exist anymore, but its website is kept alive. There are veteran members that are still active in various forms, although the organization as such doesn't exist. You would find a lot of material pointing in the same direction. Secondly, the point that all states in the Middle East are artificial, I mean, certainly in the Arab East and in North Africa are artificial, has one great exception, and that is Egypt. Egypt as a state is by no means artificial. It is the oldest existing state in the world as an entity. There are obvious reasons for this, and mainly because of the role of the Nile. Egypt has been not an invention of imperialism, but a long existing entity. But I mean, as for the rest, yes, I think I absolutely agree with this point. All other states in the Middle East are artificial creation of imperialism, and the prospect for them is unification of that area, as was the case in Italy and Germany, which were parceled into artificial, more or less creation of external circumstances, and for which the first step was the unification. But the unification of the Arabs cannot happen under capitalism. It is long gone for this. It is a task for a new socialist movement to unite this whole area. Yes, we agree.
Oh, thanks, Moshe. That's a very important correction, but absolutely right. Any other comrades want to come in? Questions or points of discussion? If not, then Moshe,
if you release me, I'm getting a little bit tired. I'm not a young man anymore, so I need some release from this.
I'm afraid that goes for all of us. But thank you very much, Moshe. That was a fantastic contribution, of really very, very worthwhile discussion. And you're welcome to come back any time.
It will be a pleasure.
Okay, thank you very much. Comrades, is there any other anything? Well, I should make an announcement just about next week's meeting. We'll be discussing the new era and the advent of the Trump era and what it will mean. Is it fascism? Is it what does it represent in the strategy of the ruling class, and what does it mean for the working class internationally? We'll be discussing that next week. So thanks for your attendance, comrades. Bye.